Hello and welcome to our Navigating the Pandemic webinar series. I'm Hayley Green, the Conference Manager for our European Technology events at Closer Still Media. Today you're joining us for our first webinar in this series focused on Is COVID-19 Accelerating the Future? Now before I hand over to our wonderful moderator and panelists, I just want to let you know that if you enjoyed today's webinar, please do sign up to the others in the series and we'll be sharing the link to the next one at the end. So let's get to the good part. I am very pleased to now hand over to our moderator, Cecilia Harvey, who's the Chief Executive Officer at High Dynamics and the founder of Tech Women Today. So thank you, and over to Cecilia.
Thank you, Hayley. It's great being here today. As Hayley said, I'm your moderator today, and my name is Cecilia Harvey. I, at this time, like to hand it over to our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. Daniel, why don't you kick off?
Sure. So I'm Daniel Hume. I do three things. I'm entrepreneur in residence for UCL's computer science, so help take technology from UCL and figure out how to have a big impact with that technology. I also run a company called Satalio, which is about 120 people. We build AI solutions for large organizations. And I also get to travel the world educating business leaders, politicians, academics about the future of society and how technology will affect that.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Elizabeth?
Wow, how do I follow that? So my name's Liz. I tend to split my time between two things. So I'm head of projects and change for a non-for-profit financial institution. And the rest of the time, I'm a leadership coach. So I spend my time particularly with technical leaders on how to build high-performing teams and structures within their organization.
Great, thanks for that. And George?
So hi everyone, hi Celia. So I work for Willis Towers Watson. I'm the digital lead. That means essentially two things that I do. One is I'm leading our consulting practice around future of work. In other words, how the impact of automation and RPA and artificial intelligence and cloud and whatnot sort of changes the organization, changes culture, changes the workplace. And the second thing that I do, I'm leading a number of innovation projects, corporate-wide projects in data and AI.
Great. Okay, let's get started because I'm very excited about today's topic of is COVID-19 accelerating the future? If you would have told me 3 months ago that we would be in this situation of a global pandemic and global shutdowns, people would be working from home, and all of a sudden the world that we knew in terms of engaging with one another, this new practice around social distancing, I would have told you were absolutely mad, but here we are in this new world. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is this discussion around the future of work, because the reality is, in my opinion, we're not going to go back to what we knew before as going into the office and sitting next to our colleagues and just sort of that normal way of working, which we all became accustomed to. So I'd love for each of you to really tell me about what is going to be this new normal, and what are some of the specific areas and initiatives and or programs that organizations really need to start focusing on as we get back into the workplace. Elizabeth, why don't you start?
So I think you're right. If anybody had said to me, we'd be in this situation a couple of months ago, I'd have kind of probably committed them to the loony bin. I don't think there will be a norm going forward. I think it'll be quite individual, is my view, depending on the organisation. Now, traditional organisations are struggling with this change and this new way of working, whereas kind of newer, maybe more entrepreneurial organisations, a bit like Daniel's, we were just talking, they're remote by default. So I think different organisations are struggling in different ways, and their future will be different because of that. I think what will be the norm now within a number of industries and companies that I'm talking to, they're already planning on going back to offices and back to work. So I think it will depend on the leaders within the organisation, how comfortable they are with the remote working and what it means for the teams and their so-called control. I think there'll be a lot of that takes stuff into account. how the organization has adapted from a trust point of view and a leadership point of view, I think will kind of shape their culture and their future. I do a lot of work within the financial sector, and they're quite traditional in their viewpoints, which I think will cause some challenges. Now, how each organization feels more comfortable about giving their employees more control, because actually that's what this pandemic has done. It's allowed employees to be more flexible about where they work, how they work, because of childcare or home care issues. That's going to be a significant challenge, and different organizations are going to tackle it differently. My viewpoint is, as leaders within each of our area, it's up to us to continue to drive forward on the positive advantages that we've all seen coming out of COVID-19. Every cloud has a silver lining, and while it's been really, really challenging in lots of areas, it's also given us opportunity, because nothing has driven digital transformation like COVID-19 as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's really important that we stay brave. Change has to have an impetus to happen, and COVID-19 has been that impetus for lots of organizations. And each of us have to take a responsibility now for making sure we continue. That is my view. What I actually think is going to happen is probably a mixed model. The traditional organizations are going to allow more flexibility because they've seen it work, and the old excuses of you can't work from home no longer stack up, because everybody's going to say, well, I've been doing it for 3 months, so how can you tell me that? I think for more entrepreneurial organizations, actually, it's not really going to change that much at all. So I think it's going to be very mixed, would be my view on it.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that this is definitely a time where I think we can really use this to turn lemons into lemonade.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunity here where we can get a lot of positive change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and continue with those changes that will make for better workplaces, better environments for people to work in going forward. And this can also be an area of competitive edge in many cases for many organizations.
Absolutely.
Into this new world, and those that are particularly successful at it. Daniel, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you think this new world order is going to be?
Yeah, sure. I think that it was the author William Gibson who said that the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I'd like to think that that Satalia, my company, is actually trying to live that future at the moment. And I think that COVID-19 will accelerate us to that future. And I'm hoping that organizations are going to be bold in using this as an opportunity to do a real paradigm change instead of an incremental step change. Because I feel like unless you don't reinvent how you operate, and then I think that companies will really, really suffer. So I think this is a great opportunity to do new things. Just as an aside, my company only has about 120 people, but we don't have any managers, any hierarchies, any KPIs. People are already free to work where they want, how they want, on whatever they want. And we use technology to enable us to operate like a swarm instead of a hierarchy. And I think that we're going to see technologies like this enabling larger organizations or any organization to operate much more like a swarm as opposed to these traditional hierarchies. And I think that that's where COVID will help us accelerate into that future.
Agreed, definitely. George, what's your opinion?
So I really liked what both Liz and Dan said. I'm just going to sort of add a little bit of color, if I may, from the point of view of the large organization, who's happen to be our clients. Okay, and they've been caught in different stages of transformation. So COVID-19 sort of fell upon them, right? Whereas there were different stages of transformation becoming, for example, agile, etc., etc. So the title that we have today is really very, to the point. We've seen some massive acceleration of change, right? Like, for instance, we were talking to our clients about the fourth industrial revolution and automation of the workplace. And, we were thinking of a time horizon of maybe 3, 4, 5 years into the future, plenty of time to adjust, make the right investments, test, whatever. And this is just gone out of the window, right? We're talking now into the digital transformation of the workplace happened over a weekend, okay? And also what we're talking about here is massive economic impact on businesses, especially big businesses, right? So the view is not clear yet. Everything is happening, but on the basis of conversations that I'm having on some of our clients, they understand that the big ask right now is not just to be agile, but also to be resilient at the same time. Okay. So agility was understood as something where, for example, you can move very quickly and capture opportunity in the market, be able to do the swarming that Dan said, bring together, the right people at the right time, to focus on sort of a given opportunity and perform very quickly, all that stuff. Okay. But what was lacking was an idea, okay, how can I, resource the right people, right? How can I build those teams both from inside and outside my organization, right? And so I can have like a cost structure around my workplace and my workforce that can provide me with resilience, okay? And I think that is the new factor that plays very strongly on business leaders' minds. They want to transform, in other words, their organizations in places where you will have that agility that confers competitiveness, but also that resilience that can absorb the impact of that huge catastrophe, I might say, which is the COVID-19.
Agreed. And I think that another reality around COVID-19 that's been introduced into the workplace is organizations are going to have to deal with this fear factor now that as people start to get back into the workplace. I think that those organizations that will really survive and that can really use this as a way to bring competitive advantage for them are those organizations that are able to address that fear factor and prove that they have the technology capabilities and the processes in place that are going to address that fear factor that has resulted as a result of the pandemic, and also that they have the ability to keep employees, the clients that they service, and the general public safe. So I think that those are definitely key factors also that is just going to be a part of the future of work, where there really needs to be a focus for organizations going forward.
Yeah, I would also, I kind of add to that is that the fear is multifaceted as well. So it's not just I don't know whether it's a fear of public transport and traveling into London, a fear of being closed, but there's also a massive fear of change. And changing in ways of working. There's a massive fear of loss of control by quite a number of kind of senior leaders and managers. So I think it kind of, that fear proliferates all the way through, and there's lots of different reasons for it as well.
Agreed.
So let me just very perhaps an idea. Well, organizations are experimenting with ways to deal with fear, right? I think we have a mix of emotions here. We definitely have fear and worry, but we also have, the feeling of I want to get out. I want to get out there and get back to work and reclaim my normal life. So there's a balance there. Just very quickly, I'm looking into how companies are sort of addressing this issue. Maybe not yet in the UK, because we're still waiting for the government to give us, some direction in terms of exit strategy and dates. But I'm looking into continental Europe, for example. Interesting example is Ferrari. So what Ferrari did in order to get people back into the office and start sort of working again, it offered a sort of, a voluntary serology test, okay, and an antibody test, I think, so people can check themselves. And it was purely voluntary. So the uptake was more than 90%, okay. And he gave that to their families as well. So essentially what this company did, Ferrari did, it offered a new benefit, essentially, right, to the workforce, something of value to the workforce. Because if you ask me, I want to be tested, right? I don't know if do you see what I mean? So, companies need to think, in terms of the culture, what are the levers they need to pull in order to really address this issue of fear, right? And to your point, Celia, successful companies will be the ones that already have, a capital of trust within the organization, i.e. the workforce trusts leaders. They are the ones that are going to be able to deal with this better. And we see that clearly. For example, companies that have sort of, sacked people, and lost trust, they will be it will be most difficult for those companies to regain the trust and deal with those emotions, I think.
No, agreed. I think that another another area is just in terms of just, going back into workplace and wondering, okay, is the person next to me, are they exhibiting symptoms? And so there's things such as contact tracing, remote monitoring capabilities. There's been so much capacity constraints just in terms of healthcare and just those institutions. But I think having the transparency around the well-being of employees is definitely going to be a key factor. To your point, George, in terms of companies being able to understand how they can turn certain factors into potentially benefits for people that they would find of value, be a huge game changer. I mean, that's the type of company that I would want to work for in the future. So it leads nicely into my next question, which focuses on what areas of investment should organizations really be focused on? As we've talked about before, the world has changed, and now organizations, whether it be for their survival, whether it be for making sure that they're able to retain staff and clients going forward, or both, what are the areas of investment that people really need to start focusing on as we enter into this potentially hopefully post-pandemic environment? Daniel?
Yeah, sure. So we build technological solutions for organizations, and we're relatively agnostic in terms of that the type of solutions we build, but we have a bit of a pedigree in workforce solutions. So I've got a very good sense about where the current demand is for technology solutions. So one is around demand prediction. So almost all demand prediction models are based on trying to predict the future based on the past, and I actually personally think that's the wrong way of doing it. And obviously now it's very difficult to predict the future based on the past, so there's definitely an opportunity there. But when I ask myself what's the right industry to look at, I ask myself two questions. One, is there a will from them engaging? And the second one, is there a way? Now you might think that the logistics industry, for example, crying out for new solutions. And yes, they have a will because they know that they need to be able to deliver more in this world, but they're firefighting every single day, which prevents them to have a way. They don't have the free people to be able to think about new integrating new technologies. Where we're seeing both of those boxes being ticked is in workforce network analysis. So companies are realizing that the new normal will be people probably working more from home, and the fear from managers is that then they don't have any visibility or control over their workforce. So we are building essentially network tools to allow you to profile individuals, their relationships between each other, using data to understand where they are, where they want to be, so that you can then better inform those decision makers about how to then optimize that workforce. So, and we're seeing that particularly in professional services industries. Now that's really exciting for me because it's using data and augmenting it with human decision making, but there are also lots of challenging ethical questions around it. Within my company, I can identify people who might leave the company before they know they're going to leave. I might be able to identify secret lovers in my company. I might be able to, I can find lots of very interesting insights from the data. And one big question is, who should have access to that information and how are they going to use it? So I do think that transparency is going to be critical, but we also have to think about the consequences of that. And so I would say that it's not just about being resilient in this new world, it's about being anti-fragile. So when these challenges do come along, how can actually the organization become stronger? And so organizations are thinking about now reinventing their organizational model with much more emphasis on purpose instead of profit. So I think that one of the reasons we're in a situation where companies are laying off people is because there has been too much emphasis on profit. And I think that we now need to hold our leaders accountable to make sure that we have a strong purpose in all of the things that we do. And I'm hoping that purpose is going to contribute positively to society. So I think that there's also a lot of interest around combining profit and purpose into the vision and strategy of organizations.
Makes sense. George, anything that you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I like this sort of idea of, combining purpose and profit. I think they can be combined. And I think, increasingly many more companies will be, will awaken to the fact that you can't motivate, your stakeholders and your shareholders and society at large simply by posting your quarterly profits. Now, in terms of sort of key technologies that I see, emerging, if you like, more as imperatives, is definitely automation and predictive and prescriptive analytics. Automation in terms of, this massive change that occurred, right? You can look into the debris of the change and see clearly what sort of processes can be very quickly automated, and operational teams, at least, in my company and others, are sort of looking into how they can quickly apply automation tools like robotic process automation and other automation tools to really, take control and make the most of those apparent efficiencies in the organization. So definitely automation is one very strong play for the most immediate future. The other one is, just extending and expanding what Dan said, as a broader application area, predictive analytics. I was working on a really interesting project for months. We have analytical tools that look into supply chains, okay? And, like most people, we did not predict the pandemic, all right? So now we have another rethink. How can we sort of move away from our traditional sort of actuarial kind of like models where we look at past history and try to sort of integrate other signals? And interestingly and anecdotally, part of the conversation, the brainstorming we did the other day was about the price of garlic. And would you know that when people in Asia are worrying about a pandemic, the price of garlic goes up because there's a high demand for garlic, because people think that garlic is a good thing to have in order to boost your immunity system, right? So if we had that signal, right, that would have predicted the pandemic by several weeks. So it's those kinds of interesting ideas that we need to start blending into how creative we are with this sort of technology around predictive analytics for the future.
Makes sense. Elizabeth, tell us what you think.
Sorry, unmuting my mic was a little bit beyond me for a second, but we're there. So I agree with both of what the guys are saying. I think the investment in technology to how people work together and get much closer to that kind of swarm mentality or collaboration technology, I think is definitely something I see. I'm going to go a little bit more old school though in my prediction. So with a number of people working from home, actually just more traditional kind of bog standard broadband Wi-Fi, I think, is actually going to be one of the biggest challenges. Most organizations now are dependent on the individual's personal and home Wi-Fi to perform what are now key processes within their organization. And I think actually we've seen some of the infrastructure challenges that we've experienced over the last 6 months. So I think a lot of organizations double checking their kind of WAN, their Wi-Fi, what their people have got at home, and supplementing that with new kit, I think is going to be. So that's kind of just like your operational. With a more future thinking, I think data is the key, and how we use that data to empower our people will be. And then the other one I think is going to be massive is actually security. With more people working from home and the cyber threats, particularly in some of the big financial industries, and data leakage and challenges all around that, I think we'll see a renewed investment in the security tooling area, and what we do in that space will be quite interesting.
Agreed. I think on the back of that, I think another area of investment, particularly being the CEO of a sensor technology company that we see a lot of, is continued demand for stronger remote monitoring capabilities.
Yeah.
So one, definitely from what we've seen just from in the world of healthcare, there's already been huge capacity constraints on existing healthcare institutions. COVID-19 has completely put more stress on that already strained system. So what many organizations are really looking for right now, particularly within the healthcare community, is around the ability to remote monitor people. So telemedicine, things like that, those requirements that we're seeing are more demand is coming, and stronger just ability to have the data in order to accurately predict and to detect when there are abnormalities in people's vitals in a remote manner, and when they should be coming to hospital versus being able to monitor things more remotely, we're seeing that as an increased demand. And I think that that will continue going forward. So one, you have it from a healthcare perspective, but also in terms of just people wanting the ability to be able to do that monitoring on their own and having that data and their intelligence for their own healthcare, and perhaps the ability to alert their family and loved ones. Because as we've seen from this pandemic, just from a lockdown perspective, we're so segregated from those that we love in many ways. So the ability to have that capability, not only for yourself, but also to share it with your loved ones to let them know, is another demand that we're seeing, and having the strong technology in order to accommodate that. But also going forward, particularly with the changing work environment, I believe that organizations are even going to need this more on an enterprise level in terms of remote monitoring abilities. So when we talk about things like contact tracing, when we talk about the ability to have technology that can detect when something is not normal in terms of people's vitals, things like that, so that people do have that comfort in terms of knowing that that they're in an environment that is safe, that they're in an environment where their employers are protecting them. It's going to be quite key for many different industries, especially when you think of not only going back into your own workplace, but when you're getting on a plane, when you're getting in a car. People are going to want that comfort. And I think that that's one of the key ways in which the world has definitely changed. And what we're seeing is that means an increase in those remote monitoring requirements, the level of functionality that people want around that, not only on an individual basis, not only applicable to the healthcare industry, but across multiple industries, especially on an enterprise level. So,
yeah, I think Daniel raised a really, really good point on this, though. It's the ethical.
Absolutely. Which introduces another aspect of things also, because one of the things, as Daniel said, is that we do need to make sure that when we're looking at the data, that it's secure. So this is going to introduce another level of data monitoring and the need for data protection and data privacy to accommodate these new requirements. And organizations need to have the responsibility in order to make sure that they are doing the right things in terms of protecting that data. So I know we lost Elizabeth there for a while, but she's coming back. And if she's got something to say on that, we're going to bring her right back in. But do you guys have anything else around that item, just around those areas of investment? And
I think just one general comment is that, well, two words of caution. One, I think that it's really important for organizations to think about investing in the future. And but I also think that we need to be very cautious about being seduced by the hype. I think there's going to be a lot of hype that's coming out of this. Technology consultants off the back of this selling old technology for new, etc., etc. So I would even claim that nobody's doing AI. So I have 20 years of experience in AI, and I would claim that nobody's doing AI. But of course, everybody's seduced by these concepts. So I think it's important to do this, but I think it's super important to get it right and not to be seduced by the hype.
Agreed. Elizabeth, is there anything that you wanted to close on this question, just around areas of investment?
No, I think I just kind of proved with my broadband dropping out the need for the infrastructure.
Definitely. Okay, great. So the next question, and I really want you all to sort of whip out your crystal balls on this, and really start talking about what is some technology that is going to be a game changer for organizations post-COVID-19. So what are some new tools that can be used to really help organizations accelerate ahead of their competition? Perhaps some things that people aren't really thinking about, perhaps things that people have been investing in already, but as a result of the pandemic, it's only going to accelerate those needs. So George, why don't you sort of give us your opinion on that?
Sure. And in fact, I'd like to pick on the point you just made before, Cecilia, if I may, around, the data, the need for data in order to get us out of COVID-19, right? So essentially what we must do, we must share data, okay? And I would argue that the new imperative, the new urgency from COVID-19 to find a way to share data. I mean, obviously, sharing data in a secure way, in an ethical way, it's essential around health. Okay, for example, the tracing apps, or how pharmaceuticals and research institutes collaborate around the production of new medicines and vaccines. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen around data sharing within those organizations. But think also, the data sharing that needs to happen if we start traveling from country to country, right? So if I want to fly to Germany needs to know if I'm well in order to allow me entry, and vice versa. Okay, so think of transportation, think of immigration, think of everything, right? So, how we share data, I think that will be, a key area for innovation for the next year or two, most definitely. And there is a framework to think around sharing data in a compliant and in a secure way, which I'd like to offer to the audience. And that framework is called a data trust. So some of you may be familiar with this concept, some of you may not. It's an idea that has been championed by the Open Data Institute here in the UK. And essentially is a legal construct that provides policies around the secure and ethical use of data. So for instance, if the NHS, for example, the NHS has health data from UK citizens, UK residents, okay? And there are companies that want to use that data. So the NHS, in a sense, is a data trust, protects the privacy of the data whilst allowing the use of the data for innovation purposes. So how we structure those relationships between, protecting, as I said, privacy, be ethical about the use. For example, having policies that say, okay, for instance, you can use my data for the next 18 months in order to do the track and tracing, but after that, the data must completely sort of disappear. So having those policies enforced will be extremely essential in order for data collaboration. And let me just finish with that as well. So there are sort of problems around data sharing that make sense in terms of public use, therefore public goods, and if you like, we need to find solution between private and public collaboration. But there are also problems around data sharing within the business world, right? I so happen to work in building a data trust for insurers. Okay, so it is, I think, it will be even more important now for companies to find ways in order to bring each one its piece of the puzzle, of the data puzzle on the table, combine those pieces of puzzle in order for the bigger picture to emerge. So collaboration, data sharing, the ethical use of data, the compliant use of data, but also monetizing your data, getting value of the data. I think these would be the keywords for moving forward.
100% agreed. Daniel, what do you think?
I have probably three comments. One is I think yes, absolutely, getting your data together or shared is the right strategy. But what the next thing is extracting insights from data, and this is the world of data science, machine learning. I mentioned the concept of network analysis, which is profiling people, understanding their relationships. Again, don't get seduced by machine learning and data science. They're very good at finding patterns from data, but I would argue that companies have decision problems. They don't have machine learning problems. They ultimately need to make decisions based on those insights. So the next one then is about optimization. So how do I allocate my resources effectively? And one of our clients is PwC, and maybe just to give you some maths very quickly, if I have 5 staff members and I need to allocate these 5 staff members to, let's say, jobs, I'm a consultancy, there are 120 possible ways of allocating these 5 staff members to jobs. There's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. If I have 15 staff members, there are over 1 trillion ways now of allocating those people to jobs, just with 15 staff members. Anything more than 7, you shouldn't be using a human for, whether you're allocating staff, whether you're routing vehicles, whether you're figuring out how to spend marketing money. And whilst at the moment there's a huge amount of emphasis on machine learning, finding patterns from data, companies have decision problems, and they need to recognize they have decision problems. That's a completely different set of technologies. But further down the line, I think blockchain, concepts around decentralization are going to be massively impactful. So my goal over the next 30 years is to take Satalia's swarm and to scale it to a planet. I want to try and create a world where everybody has the ability to boot up an idea, contribute to that idea from anywhere in the world, and be remunerated fairly for that contribution. So I've got a 30-year plan to decentralize the world. And I think that organizations are going to start going on that journey now. They're going to start opening up their innovations. They're going to start tapping into gig workers, incentivizing those gig workers, providing safety nets for those gig workers. So again, operating much more like a swarm, and that will be enabled through AI, through blockchain and decentralization. I think just one final comment is that explainability is a huge aspect of this. So when it comes to the ethics, when it comes to safety, if you're making decisions about people's lives, if you're profiling people, you need to be able to explain how you're profiling. You need to explain how you're making those decisions. And I think there are less than a handful of companies in the world that know how to build explainable systems. So if I was in your shoes and I was procuring technology solutions, I would make sure that explainability is built in.
Agreed. I think that one of the key things, one of the key challenges, one of the key opportunities for particularly technology leaders in this post-COVID-19 era is going to be around the responsible leadership and the protecting of the data and dealing with these decision problems and using the data, agreed, in order to make the right decisions for organizations. One of the things that I know at Hive that we've been looking at is using our technology in order to provide organizations with that data so that they can make more proactive strategic decisions around what they do. This whole concept, I think, around smart cities and the data required in order to have that proactive, on-demand, real-time type of data so that organizations can make the right decisions for their staff, for their clients, and in a strategic manner is just going to go through the roof in terms of requirements. And I think it's something that is really going to be a game changer in that it's going to provide those organizations that choose to go on that journey and accelerate that journey with distinct competitive advantage versus other organizations. So I think that the whole idea of smart cities and having that data is going to be absolutely critical for organizations, but also the leadership and the responsible leadership in particular that needs to be absolutely paramount in terms of making sure that we're doing the right things around that data and that we're protecting people and organizations going forward and making the right decisions.
So I have two comments about that. The first, I'm really glad you mentioned smart cities because there's a very good book that I would recommend called Scale. And I guess the argument is that companies die, ultimately, cities don't. And so the question is, how could you operate your organization much more like a city instead of a company? And that's sort of, again, around swarm, around decentralization. So I think that is, that's critical. You mentioned also about ethics. I was going to make a point and I can't remember what that point is. I'm sure it'll come to you. Maybe George has a comment. Oh, actually, sorry, I do have a comment, which is about this relates to the a question that's asked by Heather in the chat, which is around how we ensure that our leaders are being ethical. And I think that there are two ways. One is that you hold them accountable. You only work for companies or try and work for companies where they have a purpose, and you only consume from companies where they're doing positive things. So we vote with our feet. Contribute to companies that are purposeful and consume from companies that are purposeful, and the rest will die.
Yeah, I think also just in terms of what we've seen with how companies have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, the decisions that they've made in terms of how they're treating their staff, what services they're offering to their clients, how they're adjusting their business models in order to make sure that there is that level of comfort, that there is that level of transparency about what's going on. Those are the companies that people are going to want to buy from, work from, support going forward. And I think the ones that are really lacking in that ability and not really, walking the talk are going to be those ones that are going to suffer, because I think that what this pandemic has done has just really shown a light on those things that we truly value and that truly mean a lot to us, and things that are just superficial and that we can do without. And I think that that's absolutely no different in terms of the behaviors that we're seeing from companies and the values that they're truly exhibiting versus what they claim to be doing or what they say that they'll do. So absolutely agree with that.
So Cecilia, I think, you're both raising a very important point. And the question I get, is the COVID-19 pandemic enough to see a shift in values, right? For capitalism, let's call it that way, right? For a Western sort of system of the economy. Will we, although all those, ideas, okay, I want to buy something from a company that, looks after people and so on. And it's always been there, right? But we still see today, even today, I could name a number of companies, sacking, for example, laying off people who protest because there isn't, protective, gear for them to go into the workplace. So we see those, sort of, 19th century kind of like, industrial revolution behaviors in the 21st century. And they're sorely intolerable. But my big question would be, will we remember the lessons of the pandemic 18 months from now? And if we do remember those lessons as communities, as democracies, can we translate them into a new set of values that will guide the economy towards perhaps a more human-centric kind of economy rather than a very sort of profit-oriented, exploitation economy? Okay, and I think that is a big question, yet to be answered too.
Agreed. I think also, I love how you raised the point around PPE and, the personal protective equipment. What we've seen is, those organizations that are trying to make sure that they are protecting their employees by giving them the right personal protective equipment. So going forward, I think we're going to look at, what are those services, not only just from a healthcare perspective, but those people that are truly on the front lines every single day, whether it be the person in the grocery store, the person at the post office, all of these different service lines that are truly on the front lines of of this pandemic, and making sure that they have the right protective gear, and that not only that it's available to them, but that it's even in some ways optimized via technology in order to protect them in the best way possible. Those are the types of organizations that people are going to want to work for. Those are the types of organizations that people are going to want to be a part of and give their money to. So those are the values that I think will continue, but also even beyond it being values, I think it's just a necessity because the workplace has completely changed. So those organizations that aren't doing the right things by providing that personal protective equipment to their employees, they're doing themselves such a bad service, and it will definitely impact the bottom line, I think, because who's going to want to work at those organizations and who's going to want to spend money at those organizations? I certainly wouldn't. So that's another key thing, is that people need to look at, what are the tools that I need to give my employees to not only allow them to do a great job and to be productive, but also just to protect them. As organizations, just as employers, there's a duty of care responsibility. So I think that requirement really changes going forward, and perhaps for the better.
Right.
We have a question from the audience that's really, I think this is one where you can also, that's sort of aimed at you, Daniel, in terms of the concept of project swarms. And, similar to the gig economy, do we now need to change employment law and compensation models?
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. In Satalia, we historically have asked everybody to make public recommendations for their salary. So you would all publicly declare what you want to be paid, and then everybody would then vote on whether those salaries should be reduced or increased or kept the same. And we use machine learning to determine how many votes one person has for another. So if I've worked very closely with you over the past year, if I'm very knowledgeable about your domain, I will have more votes for your salary than other people. And so the question is, can you use machine learning to essentially weight people's decision making? Now, in this particular instance, it's easy to increase people's salaries, but it's very difficult from a legal perspective to decrease people's salaries. But if you do want to enable people to have flexible careers, to be able to spend half their time doing software engineering, half their time doing marketing, and to change that next year because they feel like they want to do something else, and it might affect their salary in a negative way, we need to be able to have the laws to be able to make that flexible. At the moment, you are a role and you are remunerated according to that role, and there's a career path and all that kind of stuff. And we need to move away from that, because people could have a portfolio career, not just in series, but in parallel. I could be doing photography for half of my day, and I could be doing data science for another half of my day, and I need to be smartly remunerated for that. But what we can do is we can use our peers, we can use machine learning to then make those decisions. And when you start to go into that world and not having managers and lines of accountability, then it does raise a lot of questions about whether our employment laws are set up to enable this future world.
Can I jump in here? Sorry, one of the massive benefits of living in the countryside is really crap broadband. So apologies for dipping in and out and trying to get it sorted. I think you're absolutely right. The employment law definitely needs to change, and you'll see how sometimes that employment law is used currently incorrectly. So what the law was intended for and what it's actually being used for is entirely different things. But I've got a question for you, Daniel. How do you deal then with, is there any role parity across your organization? So developer A, developer B and developer C, is there any parity, or is it at an individual level?
There is parity. So we scrape information from the market, so we understand how to benchmark people's salaries. We obviously benchmark it internally, but we really try to avoid this idea that you are a software developer and you produce software, because as we all know, a human contributes many different aspects to an organization. They can inspire teams, even if not the best software engineer in the world. They can do all sorts of things. So we're trying to capture all of those different value adds, and we're trying to profile people in a much more complex way. So it's actually very difficult then to compare one person against another, because I guess there's a very good Black Mirror episode called Nosedive, where there's essentially an app that everybody is scoring each other out of 5, and what it does is that gives you a score that you carry around with you. So I'm a 4.2 and you're a 3.6, and when you score people in this simplistic way, then you create tension, you create an unsafe environment. So we're trying to think, how could you actually bring in all of the complexities of what it means to be human, so it makes it very difficult for humans to compare and contrast, but gives you control over your career and over your future development.
So if I may just add perhaps just one little thing, because this is a great conversation. We clearly see a transition towards, more purposeful and meaningful work, which means something that cannot possibly conform into straight jacket of a role, right? So clearly we see that, and companies are trying to sort of get their heads around, how do we manage that, right? We can go all the way to what Dan is saying, and that's the way they should be going, right? Use machine learning, user assistance, but that's like, be terrifying for them. So, one key idea that, in my opinion, underpins that transformation is the concept of skills, right? And this is part of the new narrative, if you like, the transformation of work towards those more purposeful, multifaceted kind of that we make within the workplace. It's underpinned by skills, right? And skills provide both a basis for rethinking work, but also provide an incentive for people to enter into this new sort of relationship with the employer. In those terms, if I want to become a better Python coder, for example, right, I want to develop my skill further, then here's my incentive of actually getting myself involved into projects and whatnot and learn a little bit more of that, right? I also want to be a great photographer, likewise. Or maybe I am already a good photographer and I can be a mentor to somebody and pass my knowledge over. So that kind of like more complex, more rich relationship between skills, between peoples, between objectives, between incentives. I think this is this is the new topography of the future workplace.
And maybe
one of the questions just around, what do we think it means for inequality and enabling more people to participate in this new future? So, for example, good broadband, access to digital device skills. This crisis has shown that up to 11 million people in the UK don't have basic digital skills and can't access healthcare, education, etc. So thank you, Lisa, for that question. But I think it raises a good point that this is going to expose a lot of inequality that exists.
I think it is silly. So I work a lot. So we've got whole call centres that are now working from home. The basic salary call centres, starting salary of about 16k a year, and we're now in a situation where we're saying you've got to have decent enough broadband. So that's what, 40, 45, 50 pound a month. You've got to have a machine because you were normally based in an office and now you've got to try and work from home. And I think we kind of just assume these things because for us working in technology, it's just natural. But in lots of instances, it's not. And it is showing that equality. And then you've got the additional challenge of single parents with children at home and how we provide flexibility for that. So I think it's going to get even worse, and organisations are going to have to think more about the package that they provide their employees in order to be able to work in this new and interesting model. It would be interesting. I don't know how you guys work, but does any of your organisations pay for your broadband, for example?
Not mine, but let me just, you're both raising a very important point in terms of inequality, but at the same time, this is an opportunity to reduce inequality.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, get this right. If we get the reskilling out, it reduces inequality. Very quick example, we worked with a client in the US that did oil drilling, right? And they had a bunch of workers that would go out at the offshore platforms to do scheduled maintenance of, and they were men, and quite sort of physical men in order to withstand the rigors of going out there in the platform. But once they've automated the platform with sensors and those men were not needed, they were retrained to sit on an onshore office, do analytics and, learn how to use machine learning, in fact, to look at, trouble on the platform on a screen, okay? Because completely, redesign the role. But you know what? This role can be done by anybody. You don't have to be, a sort of, really physical man in order to do this job. So that role of schedule, maintenance engineer for an oil platform was open to everybody, including, very skinny women, if I may say so. Okay, so that reduce inequalities and biases in that role. So there is a huge, huge, huge opportunity. I think it's the opportunity to reskill people so they can do those digital jobs.
I agree. I think organizations that really are able to identify that gets back to what I said earlier about being able to turn this pandemic, making lemonade from lemons, and I think that's what's really gonna be, sort of separate those organizations that you want to work for, that you want to buy from the organizations that are probably going to be disrupted by a lot of what's happening right now in a negative way.
Yeah, I think I would echo that, and I would echo that there are going to be inequalities that are surfaced from this new world, but I think that there's opportunities to deal with many inequalities that already exist. So the question is it going to be a better world than what already exists? And I think that we can make it a better world. I think that totally echo that.
I think it will be what we all decide it to be. If we view it as a positive, and if we look at the opportunities and the silver linings, and we are brave and we move forward, then that's exactly what will happen. But if we allow to focus on the fear and what's not right, then you kind of get what you put out, would be my view on it.
There is one inequality that I am concerned about, actually, which is the people who are employed and have all of the protections of employment versus the people that are going to ultimately be big gig workers. Mm-hmm. And if you break your arm and you can't work or whatever, then how are you remunerated? And so we are obviously seeing the gig economy booming. Companies are taking advantage of more flexible workforces, and I think that in some respects people are taking a hit for that flexibility. Absolutely. And so we need to make sure that the government and companies are paying attention to those people who are gig workers and have those protections and provisions in place, because otherwise we are going to see a separation and a discrimination between those two.
Yeah, and I think that comes part and parcel with all the kind of employee laws that we're looking. I think it definitely needs a revamp across the piece for what the future is now and what the future looks like kind of going forward. I think they're quite outdated and antiquated.
Agreed. Which is a good segue into another question that we have from Heather. So George, this one's aimed towards you. How would you advise organizations to rebuild and ignite their cultures, especially if working from home becomes the new normal in the future?
Absolutely. So that's an excellent question. So, let me answer the question with another question, perhaps. How does culture change, right? What is culture? Culture is a set of behaviors. In fact, that's what it is. If we wanted to reduce it into what is culture, it's a set of behaviors, right? And once you start sort of thinking about it, what those behaviors look like and how you can categorize them, you can clearly see that some companies are successful because people behave in a certain way, rather than other companies are less successful because people are behaving in a different way. For instance, how do you solve a problem, right? Do you, for example, criticize people for not solving it? Do you look back, if you like, and try to analyze, what went wrong? Or do you spend more of your time to sort of look forward and try to find a solution to the problem? That is a behavior, okay? And there are ways to unlock that kind of behavior in a company, okay? There are sort of techniques that come from, organizational psychology, and there is science behind all that, okay? We don't have to invent new things. It's how we apply, the scientific knowledge in big and complex organizations. And ultimately, what is the role of leaders? Because, it's the profile and the psychology and the personality and the aspirations and the visions of leaders at every level, actually, but the higher you get, the more important it becomes. That kind of like trickles down into the whole organization. There's this interesting interesting story with Intel many years ago, right, where the CEO wrote a book called "Only the Paranoid Survive," okay, and that kind of reflected on the psychology of the whole organization. Why? Because so intellectual property was very important. So now that we're moving into this sort of very sort of digital environment, I believe companies should look into their culture, understand what are the sort of the key ingredients that make them successful, and try to preserve those key ingredients in the culture moving forward, and then use this opportunity to change the things that don't work. Right. For example, if collaboration wasn't feature of your culture before, maybe now this is the time to become a feature of your organization, because it's the only way people can work. They have to come together and collaborate, as we are, for example, right now in a video conferencing.
Yeah, culture is an extension of the personality of the leadership, and I think we know that in small companies and big companies. But you don't have to be higher in the hierarchy to be an influencer. We know we have influencers across our entire organization who are not necessarily up the hierarchy, which is why, again, I'm advocating the swarm model, because what you can do is you can identify those influencers and empower them by giving them information, by giving them tools to, again, embed culture into the organization. So you can do it in a much more smarter, scientific, data-driven way.
Agreed. Elizabeth, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's right to say the key word in this is influencers. It's the people that people listen to will be the difference between how things kind of move forward and what happens. And I think we are tribal by nature as people, and we will follow the tribe or follow the leader within the tribe, and that's the influencer. There's nothing to do with hierarchical role, in my opinion.
Agreed. Well, I think we've reached that time where we've had a great session. This has been an amazing content. I want to thank all of our panelists for just the amazing insight that you've really given into this topic. Just the level of depth that we really explored it today. So thank you all for your time. And I want to thank everybody in our audience also for joining the first of our webinar series. But once again, thank you everybody, and hope that you are keeping safe and getting ready to emerge back into this post-COVID-19 world. Haley, why don't you take it over?
Hello, can you hear me? I was having a little problem there getting back on. Thank you very much.
Haley's battling the mute button, I guess.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone, and obviously a big thank you to our panelists, Liz, George, Daniel, Cecilia. What a fantastic panel and great discussion to kick off the first in this series. I'm not sure how we're going to top it. So to our audience, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you found this valuable. If you are interested to join our next webinar in the series, you can register on the pop-up now that I've just hopefully sent to you all. Also, just after this webinar, there will be a mini survey emailed to you, so please do use this and share your feedback on what content you'd like to see going forward. Once again, thank you very much to all our speakers and to our audience for listening in, and we'll see you next week.